Member for Fredericton South and leader of his party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, it's a privilege to represent the people of Fredericton South in this Legislative Assembly and to work as a parliamentarian for the people of our province. Je suis fier de travailler dans mon rôle de parlementaire et chef du parti vert pour tous nos peuples dans chaque coin de la province. I am grateful that the people of Kent North and Member Cook Tantramar chose to return their Green MLAs to the 60th Legislative Assembly. And I want to congratulate all those elected for the first time, as well as all those who are returning to the legislature. These are unprecedented times, perhaps, Mr. Speaker, and we now are giving our speeches through masks. It's an important message, I think, to convey to the public of this province about the measures that we all need to take to keep each other safe and secure. I want to extend my condolences to those families who have lost loved ones to the coronavirus here and maybe have family members outside of New Brunswick and the rest of Canada or in the United States or overseas. And I want to ensure all those who have come down with the virus that we're thinking of them, along with those who are in isolation now, wondering and waiting for their test results. I want to recognize that we work on the unceded and unsurrendered land of the Wolastoqey here in this Legislative Assembly, and that the legal basis of our relationship is governed by the treaties of peace and friendship, which are enshrined in the Canadian Constitution. This, in effect, means we're all treaty people. So as treaty people, as New Brunswickers, we have a reasonable expectation that the government of the day will always take our treaty partners, the Wolastoqey, the Mi'kmaq, and the Passamaquoddy nations, seriously. Dans le discours de Trône, le Premier ministre a écrit « C'est le moment de bâtir une société qui ne laisse personne pour compte au nouveau-brunswick ». Je suis d'accord. In the Throne speech, he also wrote the government seeks to empower regions and communities across the province and above all make citizens the top priority. I support this. Excellent sentiments. In the Throne speech, he says he wants to build an economy that defies narrow thinking. Mr. Speaker, I agree. What we need to get out of is narrow thinking. Undoubtedly, all members in this House support these goals. But to attain them, we need supportive and effective public policy. There's no other way to achieve them. And that, of course, is the role of this House, the role of the executive branch to bring forward proposals and for us to debate them, and for private members, too, to bring forward their proposals in the form of private members' bills or motions. Does this Throne speech give me the confidence that such public policy is currently being contemplated? Not really. The Throne speech was slim on detail. One might even say mundane. And it's a frustrating thing to have to read between the lines in a Throne speech to try and suss out what's really being contemplated. So, Mr. Speaker, we don't really know. We know that to achieve the goals that are set out in the Throne speech that I just listed would require a departure from the past, departure from past policies, and an acknowledgement of the actual changes that we need in New Brunswick. Instead, the Throne speech feels a bit old-fashioned. A little old-fashioned when I read it. And it's, at least when it comes to the government's priorities, it's written to address, I think, what seems like the realities of another era, an alternate reality from today that we actually find ourselves in. For example, it's surprising to me that in the Throne speech, there's actually no mention of some fundamental developments in this province with the Wolastoqey and Mi'kmaq nations asserting their title to much of New Brunswick in the court. It's extraordinary that a Throne speech wouldn't acknowledge the fact that that is happening and give some sense of how the government intends to move forward in response. Nor is there even a mention of the need to root out the systemic racism from government institutions and services, never mind proposing any concrete actions to do so, despite what's been going on in our province very publicly. The condolences section of the speech, sadly, did not mention the deaths of Chantal Moore or Rodney Levi at the hands of police officers, and that's a tragic oversight. While Black Lives Matter has become a rallying cry around the world, there's not a word about how government intends to tackle anti-Black racism here, despite the fact that Black Lives Matter New Brunswick has brought forward a series of very specific proposals that the provincial government could adopt. So I guess that leaves with me the question is how does the Premier expect to build a society that doesn't leave anyone behind when the throne speech itself actually does just that, by excluding these mentions as I have outlined? Well, we've heard, we read in the throne speech where we've been in the fight against COVID. It's slim on detail about where we're going. Again, it makes it feel a little bit like an alternate reality that it's addressing, because we're living the longest state of emergency ever declared in this province. We remain mired in a pandemic. So it would be reasonable for anyone reading the throne speech wondering, well, now what? People are anxious. More and more are struggling with their mental health, feelings of isolation. Physicians now are telling us that seniors have suffered cognitive decline because of the isolation experienced in their long-term care homes that they live in. Post-secondary students have mentioned to me that they intend to drop out of school or not come back in the new semester because of the difficulty in learning online, and this is particularly the case for some first-year students. There are people who can no longer make ends meet because their jobs have disappeared, while local small businesses and nonprofit organizations are worrying fundamentally about whether they can make it through the winter. There'll be a whole lot more people who are left behind thanks to COVID, unless the Premier has an actual plan to support them, and that didn't come out in this throne speech. Le gouvernement Higgs va devoir dépenser de l'argent pour soutenir les gens et les petites entreprises. Il ne peut pas continuer à attendre du gouvernement fédéral qui réponde à tous nos besoins tant qu'un vaccin ne sera pas facilement accessible, à moins qu'il ne soit à l'aise de laisser les gens et les petites entreprises derrière lui. Le Premier ministre devra résoudre cette équation et investir dans nos citoyens et citoyennes. The pandemic has revealed problems with the capacity of our care sectors, whether it's health care, mind care, home care, long-term care for seniors, or care for our environment. It's also exposed the holes in our social safety net, through which so many fall. Lacking safe, affordable housing, sufficient income to afford them the necessities of life, or a sense of belonging where they feel connected to each other and their community. La pandémie nous a également montré à quel point notre économie peut être fragile, qu'il s'agisse de sa dépendance à l'égard de la main-d'œuvre importée, de sa dépendance à l'égard des biens et services importés, ou de sa dépendance à la vente de produits de base aux États-Unis et ailleurs. Yet the government priorities presented in the speech do not reflect these realities. They're written as if the pandemic is not a factor. How do these priorities fit into the plan to manage the pandemic until sufficient people are vaccinated to defeat the coronavirus? What steps are being taken to protect vulnerable people and those small businesses at greatest risk from the consequence of the pandemic? What is the path to recovery? I don't see that in the government priorities delineated in the speech from the throne. Speaking of reality, the urgency of action to address the other global crises of the climate emergency and the unraveling of nature is nowhere reflected in the throne speech. It's as if our lives do not actually utterly depend on a stable climate and the natural world. Any path to recovery has to recognize these realities. It has to be a green recovery. Monsieur le Président, le discours de Trône ne suit pas cette voie. C'est peut-être parce que nous ne partons pas du même point en ce qui concerne le rôle du gouvernement. Greens believe that the role of government is to serve the collective needs of its citizens, both in the short term and for the long term. The market is incapable of doing this. In fact, the market can damage citizens, their communities, and the environment upon which we depend if inadequately regulated. I want to recognize the Premier's leadership in establishing the All-Party COVID Cabinet Committee and the contributions my colleagues who have participated in the committee and continue to participate have made to its work. It also can't be said enough that we have a remarkable public health team here in Fredericton in the office of our Chief Medical Officer of Health, Dr. Jennifer Russell, and in each of our separate health regions with the regional medical officers of health, their teams, supported by contact tracers who play an instrumental role in helping to smother local outbreaks when they flare up. And I think that's an important thing to stress for people listening, Mr. Speaker, that an essential element to smothering the outbreaks when they occur in regions of our province is the testing, the contact tracing, the self-isolation and quarantining, and repeat, and repeat, and repeat. And the capacity remains there to do that and do it effectively, and it's why the previous outbreaks in Campbellton and Moncton were smothered, one in 2 weeks and the other in 4 weeks. 4 weeks because the number of contacts were greater, and that took more time to sort out. But that happened in both cases, and it will happen again with current outbreaks that are happening in our regions. A significant part of the success in managing the pandemic, though, has been controlling travel over our borders. Canada didn't do this early enough. New Brunswick did. And we continue to benefit from this decision. When you think about only 20% of the pre-pandemic traffic is going across our borders that once did, that's quite a huge change. But still, it's something like 25,000 vehicles coming into New Brunswick from other provinces and the United States outside of the Atlantic bubble, including about 7,500 trucks every week. For personal vehicles, we're talking about 11,000 coming through Maine a week and 6,000 entering from the rest of Canada through Quebec, and about 1,000 people arrive at our airports every week in New Brunswick. The rules about who can cross our borders and what constraints they are under on arrival, I think, need to be clearer to all New Brunswickers, and government can do better to communicate what those rules are. If citizens are a top priority, then communications to our citizens needs to be a top priority, Mr. Speaker. And I realize it's so easy when information lives on the internet to say it's on the website, but is that really, in the end, reaching everyone you want to reach by simply saying it's on the website or referring people to the website? I think a lot more can be done. Les gens ont besoin de plus d'informations sur la gestion de la pandémie au Nouveau-Brunswick, et non pas moins. Lorsque les choses dérapent, il faut en faire un moment d'apprentissage et non quelque chose que l'on doit cacher. The throne speech needed to commit, I think, to improving communications. That's what I would like to have seen about outbreaks and the rules designed to prevent them in both official languages. Je crois qu'il est grand temps que le Premier ministre nomme un francophone de son cabinet comme porte-parole de son gouvernement dans les médias francophones. The digital divide looms large here. With many people unable to access information online, large number of people, however, still rely on the radio. for their information. And that radio could be used as a means to communicate more broadly with New Brunswickers about the pandemic. Even those who are routinely online and you would expect would feel well informed don't necessarily do. I've been approached by students, for example, who say they want to do the right thing when they've returned from visiting parents, say after Thanksgiving, outside of the Atlantic bubble. They don't want to get in trouble, but they're not quite sure. They weren't quite sure of the requirements. So if students who are really savvy with social media and online more than many are unsure about the rules, then that, I think, sends a message that the broader population probably is not. So communications has got to become more effective as we move into winter. There does need to be effective supports put in place for those most affected by COVID. We can think of seniors living alone, seniors living in long-term care, persons with disabilities, those suffering from mental illness, single parents, families living in poverty, and people whose jobs have been eliminated because of the coronavirus or by measures to control its spread. It's not a complete list, but it's the start of a list for those most affected. Le discours de Trône ne prévoit aucun plan pour soutenir les gens. Comment cela se peut-il? Les gens doivent pouvoir vivre dans la dignité et toute sécurité et avec le revenu nécessaire pour payer le loyer et l'épicerie. Le moment est venu d'instituer un revenu de base garanti. C'est une initiative qui serait à la hauteur de la rhétorique de transformation du Premier ministre. The time is right to introduce a guaranteed livable income to support people who lack adequate income to meet their needs. The Greens have proposed this be instituted first for persons with disabilities and then be extended to everyone living on low and essentially fixed incomes. A guaranteed livable income is how we can ensure no one actually is left behind. It truly would help reinvent New Brunswick by reinventing our failed model of income support. The elderly have been most negatively affected by COVID. The throne speech makes no mention, really, of supporting seniors in long-term care facilities, which is surprising. Despite the deaths that have occurred, despite the difficulty staff have in accommodating visitors and carrying out the work they have before them, despite the staff shortages, despite the cognitive decline that so many have experienced being isolated from family. In their hour of need, the funds weren't there for the long-term care homes to provide the services they need to ensure families could visit their loved ones even when they were able. Instead, government waited for the federal government to act and provide some money to support long-term care homes. That can't happen again. We can't force our long-term care homes to wait when they need funds to support the seniors or the residents, their staff, and the families who need to be able to help their loved ones. Once again, though, we do have a throne speech that promises to help seniors to stay in their homes. But we've heard this time after time, as far back as David Alward's government. Home first. And yet, nothing has really changed. There hasn't been, effectively, any more support put in place to help keep seniors in their homes. Seniors continually tell me they can't find the support they need. So, I guess I'm saying I hope this time the commitment is followed by the necessary budget in the new year to actually enable seniors to stay in their homes, enable them to find the support they need to do so. When it comes to business support, the provincial government really does need to focus on keeping small businesses alive. When I read the throne speech, it focuses on increasing productivity. There's quite a lot of discussion about that. But really, Mr. Speaker, if a business is forced to close its doors, it's producing nothing. So it's premature to be focusing on productivity if we don't have supports in place to ensure that small businesses who are at greatest risk can weather this pandemic storm and come out the other end. And then we can talk about productivity. If they're not producing anything anymore, it's a moot point. So some combination of postponement or forgiveness of property taxes and forgivable loans are necessary to enable those small businesses most at risk from COVID to survive until we have the vaccine. And we can think about the kinds of businesses that are most at risk: restaurants, bars, tourism businesses, private entertainment venues, the kinds of places that will need help this winter. The throne speech devotes much of its space to the government's priorities, which presumably, one could say, represent its path to recovery. There's not much new here. There's nothing that helps build a society, really, where nobody is left behind to meet the goal that the speech sets out at the beginning, where citizens are top priority, where communities and regions are empowered, where economic development is imagined differently. It reads like the same old, same old. Now, maybe government has plans. Maybe government has policy proposals they intend to make that are consistent with the goals laid out in the throne speech, but they certainly don't emerge from reading the throne speech, no matter how many times you read it. I would like to frame it up in this way with three things, three areas of government policy needed to chart a path to a green recovery. So one, the promotion of the personal and social well-being of people in the near and long term. Two, the promotion of sustainable economic progress. And three, the protection and restoration of nature's balance upon which we utterly depend. The throne speech focuses on growing the GDP as the goal, not well-being. And we know blindly increasing the GDP without thinking about the well-being of people can undermine that very well-being, and has. We can think about well-being in terms of housing, food security, health, mental wellness, social connections, income and disposable income, safety, care, access to it, education and training. These are the kinds of measures by really which we should be judging progress. But we don't. J'ai déjà parlé de la nécessité d'instituer un revenu de base garanti pour vivre. Ce serait audacieux. Ce serait une véritable transformation. What about housing policy? We've got a growing crisis for lack of affordable housing in the province. But currently, the provincial target for these 3 years is simply 155 new housing units. It's a mere drop in a leaky bucket because the numbers of people precariously housed and those who are homeless continues to grow. That's why I say a leaky bucket. So it's too little, and the need is growing. Government needs to see a sizable investment. We need to see a sizable investment to enable nonprofit housing organizations to develop or redevelop far more housing. Borrowing is inexpensive these days. Just look at the high-end apartments being built in our major cities. Money's cheap. Apartments are going up everywhere. But for the well-heeled, the well-off, the comfortable, not those who need affordable housing. Who can develop that? Well, nonprofit housing organizations, and of course commercial developers who choose to work to include low-income units within their developments. So where are these affordable housing developments? The province has pulled back from investing in the development of new housing projects that receive federal funds. So if you're a nonprofit housing organization and you've got a development project to build or renovate, to create new affordable housing units, and there's federal funds in that, the province has said, sorry, we're not throwing in to make that happen. And that decision was made in the summer. That policy needs to be reversed. And needs to be reversed now. What about commercial developers? Well, I have one in my riding, Mr. Speaker, who was building a 100-unit building, and they're a locally owned developer. They want to do the part, step up. And they were prepared to have 25% of their units as low-income units, but had difficulty in negotiating with social development over that. In the end, social development agreed to 4 instead of 25. So here's a private developer, a local private developer, not someone, company from far away or large corporation, successful, community-minded, local developer who was trying to do the right thing and was stymied from achieving it. So, Mr. Speaker, I think perhaps if we had legislation that enabled municipalities to require developers to provide affordable units as a proportion of their overall developments, that would force social development's hand to figure out how to work better with the private sector to achieve just that. We're seeing all around us now that there's a desperate need for rent controls as properties are being snapped up by outside interests, and the new owners are jacking up the rents on the tenants, so they are no longer affordable. Speech fails to mention this reality that's facing a growing number of people, both in our cities and in our rural areas. That's what I mean about an alternate reality. It's not addressed in the throne speech. How can that be when it's affecting so many people? When asked about this, the Premier and the Minister of Social Development just say, well, we'll leave the rents to the market. Mr. Speaker, the market has no values, it has no conscience, it has no responsibility to ensure everyone is housed. Action is needed. I don't know what a family is supposed to do now if they can't afford an unreasonable rent increase in a market that is dominated by these high rental units. An obsession with letting market forces run rampant over people's lives is exactly the opposite of building a society where no one is left behind. What about health care? What sort of policy should we be expecting? Ce remède de la pandémie va demander des investissements majeurs pour améliorer l'accès aux soins de santé mentale. Si le déploiement des cliniques de santé mentale sans rendez-vous est un début, nous devons transformer nos équipes mobiles d'intervention en santé mentale en première intervenant 24 heures sur 24, 7 heures sur 7. Et nous devons trouver un moyen d'intégrer la psychothérapie dans le système d'assurance maladie. Ce seraient des éléments transformateurs. We're facing a doctor shortage that is reaching crisis proportions in places as diverse as Fredericton and Campbellton. What's to be done? It's not clear, Mr. Speaker, from the throne speech. This is driving a lot of people unnecessarily to ERs, and with the pandemic, people are avoiding ERs and perhaps getting sicker. It's time, perhaps, to free up family doctors from the hospital obligations, put in place a new model, replacing them with hospitalists hired in our hospitals to allow family physicians to focus on their practices and hospitalists to focus on patients in the hospitals. Meanwhile, as far as family practices go, we finally need to move to what government after government has been talking about, and that is to put in place multidisciplinary family care teams where the doctor is a member, along with many other health professionals. That would be transformative. What about equitable access to abortion services? Now that Clinic 554 is closed, women living throughout Western New Brunswick have no access without traveling to Moncton or Bathurst. That's hardly equitable access. What about access to LGBTQ affirming health care? Impossible to come now that Clinic 554 is closed. Perhaps it's believed that it's okay to leave behind these New Brunswickers because of the services in particular that they seek. Well, it's not. There are many other measures of well-being when we're thinking about GDP instead of GDP, or in addition to GDP. We can think of our trust in our institutions, stewarding our cultural identities, promoting equality and inclusion, restoring nature's balance, stabilizing the climate, and fostering a sense of belonging and purpose. We need to see progress in each of these areas. These are important indicators of a healthy society with a good quality of life where no one is left behind. Obsessively focusing on the GDP as a measure of progress will ensure that the well-being of New Brunswickers, in the end, declines rather than improves. Le gouvernement doit absolument établir un climat de confiance avec les Acadiens et les autres francophones qui doivent savoir que le gouvernement s'efforcera d'accroître l'égalité de nos deux communautés linguistiques officielles. Une révision efficace de la loi sur les langues officielles est essentielle pour y parvenir. Il doit y avoir des audiences publiques. Never again should we hold a review of the Official Languages Act in camera in this Legislative Assembly. These hearings must absolutely be public. Consider the environment upon which our well-being utterly depends. Wildlife populations are crashing in our forests because essential habitat is being clear-cut and converted into tree farms. Restoring the diversity and complexity of our forest ecosystems now lies beyond anybody's lifetime. Startling to think about it that way. But these goals should be goals of public policy, and we don't see them in the throne speech. I fear outside of the much heralded nature reserves will be one big forest sacrifice zone, unless clear-cutting is replaced with a softer, more thoughtful approach to logging. Our consumption of gasoline, coal, and natural gas is destabilizing our climate and acidifying our coastal waters right here in New Brunswick. Startling. No mention of it in the throne speech. Direct impacts on our fisheries. No mention of it in the throne speech. Rather than expressing any sense of urgency to cut carbon pollution or transform forestry, essentially all we get is a gradually phased-in ban on plastic bags over the coming years. Madam Speaker, this is, well, environmental drivel. Former Premier Bernard Lord really was the last Premier to take the climate emergency seriously 20 years ago. It's true. He did. He did a lot of good. The reason we have any renewable energy on the MV power system today is because of Bernard Lord's vision to require a legally binding target for MV power to sell a portion of the electricity we use from renewable sources to us. That was Bernard Lord. That was 20 years ago. Nothing has happened since. He brought in our first climate action plan, Mr. Speaker, Madam Speaker, and worked with the New England governors and Eastern Canadian premiers to come up with targets around this entire region. We have had a climate action plan since 2016 that is consistent with achieving our share of the Paris target, but neither the Liberals nor the Tories have bothered to implement it. So the Premier asked me the other day, well, what are the most pressing priorities in terms of implementing that plan? Well, here are some that would make a big impact. Institute community and land use planning that actually facilitates development that is low carbon, not high carbon. Safeguard our wetlands, floodplains, and forested areas to protect communities and critical infrastructure from the consequences of the climate crisis, like flooding and intense rainfall. Ensure government is carbon neutral in its operations, facilities, and vehicles by 2030, 10 years from now. And these are commitments in the current climate action plan, which this government has said that they have adopted. So these are not my suggestions. These are commitments in the current plan which this government has embraced. Increase the use of cleaner transportation modes, including electric vehicles, public transportation, cycling and walking in our cities. Imagine, and this is me, imagine a maritime rail network that links our cities together with northern New Brunswick. That's thinking outside of the box. That's doing something that would be transformational. Establish targets for increasing energy efficiency in homes and businesses. supported by zero-interest loans and custom technical advice. Soutenir l'utilisation accrue des sources d'énergie renouvelables pour fournir du chauffage et de l'électricité aux foyers et aux entreprises grâce à une législation qui remplace les obstacles existants dans la loi sur l'électricité par des politiques positives. What better way to improve social well-being and ecological progress than engaging local communities and regions as equal partners? I look forward to the reform of local governance because of its potential to energize grassroots democracy and encourage active citizenship. The institution of local government needs to be a priority, but the form it takes has got to be the responsibility of citizens in community. To foster economic progress, the Trône speech doesn't make any proposals, really, that you would say defy narrow economic thinking. It relies on traditional models that government after government has followed since the 80s that just haven't worked. If the Premier wants to reinvent New Brunswick, we need an alternative development model that is more sustainable and more suitable to the size of New Brunswick. Nous avons besoin d'une approche au développement économique qui soit conforme aux besoins et aux valeurs des gens du Nouveau-Brunswick. Cela veut dire qu'il faut accorder plus d'attention à la sécurité, la stabilité et à la résilience, et moins à la croissance avec le PIB. It's time to stop playing who wants to be a billionaire. Instead, we should increase our capacity to take care of our needs locally. Stop obsessing with export growth and look at how we can replace imports by meeting our own needs for food, for energy, and for other goods services. Increasing our supply of energy from our abundant renewable resources to achieve greater energy security should be the government priority, not pursuing yet more nuclear power. In fact, on Wednesday, the University of Calgary's School of Public Policy released a report that found the cost of wind and solar power is now on par with natural gas. And it's attracting private investment from all over the world, which the nuclear option is not. Increasing our food supply from local farms and processors to achieve greater food security should be an equally important government priority. Yet the Trône speech wants to expand production of export commodities to make a greater contribution to world markets. What happened to the Premier's newfound commitment to make us more food self-sufficient? That's something I would like to know. Look, small and medium-sized enterprises, businesses, and cooperatives are the backbone of our economy, and they provide most of the jobs. Effective policies to drive energy security, food security, and the substitution of locally produced goods for imports will be rocket fuel for our small and medium-sized businesses. Let's get on with that. Yet the Trône speech section on the private sector reads like it's more directed towards Bay Street, not Main Street, continuing the tradition of favoring the big guys over the little ones. And the forestry sector is a case in point, where the small business people who produce wood in this province, woodlot owners, continue to be undermined by government policy and its refusal to enforce its own legislation, flooding the market with cheap wood from Crown land. While Premier Higgs has won a majority government, my colleagues and I, the Green Caucus, are committed to shining a light on real needs in our communities. We're committed to promoting solutions to the challenges we face, and we will play our role as an opposition party to hold the government to account over their policies, not their personalities. New Brunswickers have our commitment that we will continue to think long-term, and we will continue to push their well-being, put their well-being and that of the communities to which they belong and the health of the environment upon which we utterly depend at the heart of our work in this Legislative Assembly of New Brunswick. Thank you, Madam Speaker. Merci, Madame la Présidente. Lee one.